بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الخلق أجمعين محمد وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. The subject about fiqh, and we have reached the obligatory things at time of the prayer. We discussed before about Takbirat al-Ihram and then about standing, necessity of standing at time of Qira'at of Surah Al-Hamd and Qul Huwallahu Ahad, and also before Ruku'. And today we reached Qira'at or reciting the Surah Al-Hamd and other Surah of the Holy Quran, issue 987. In the daily obligatory prayers, one should recite Surah Al-Hamd in the first and second rak'ats, and thereafter one should, on the basis of a precaution, recite one complete surah. The Surah Al-Duha and Surah Inshirah are treated as one surah in prayer, and so are the Surah Al-Fil and Quraysh, Layla fi Quraysh. Here he mentions that Surah Al-Hamd is obligatory. You cannot exchange it with any other surah. So in the first rak'at and second rak'at you have to recite Surah Al-Hamd. After Surah Al-Hamd, is it obligatory to recite full surah or few ayahs is sufficient? Well, usually our Sunni brothers said no, few ayahs are sufficient. But according to Fiqh of Ahlul Bayt, our ulama said no, it has to be full surah. Though Ayatullah Al-Sistani here, he put it as a obligatory precaution. On the basis of precaution, he said, one has to recite one complete surah. So in that case, now if you start with a long surah like Surah Al-Baqarah, you can recite it in the prayer, is allowed, but then it will take 2 hours, 3 hours to complete it. You know, you have to count for the time, and you should have enough time. Otherwise, if you recite it in morning prayer, for example, then sunrise will be there, and you have not finished your prayer. You know, so in that case, you may choose a short surah, and you recite it all that surah. So it is one surah. Surah Al-Hamd by itself is obligatory in first and second rak'at. But after Surah Al-Hamd, any one surah of the Holy Quran. So maybe in first rak'at you recite Inna Anzalna, for example, in second rak'at Qul Huwallahu Ahad. Or maybe in first rak'at after Surah Al-Hamd, Inna A'tainaka Al-Kawthar, in the second rak'at, for example, Surah Wal Asr Inna Al-Insana Lafi Khusr, and so on. But it should be complete surah. But here at the end he said the Surah Wal-Duha and Alam Nashrah has to be recited together, not only one of them. Why? Because there are saying that these two were one surah and they were divided into two surahs. They put Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim between them. So بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى and ألم نشرح لك صدرك ووضعنا عنك وزرك الذي أنقض ظهرك. There are claims that these two are one surah. So if you recite one, probably you have not completed a full surah. So you have to recite them together, both of them. And also he said Surah Al-Fil and Layla fi Quraysh. So Surah Al-Fil, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, ألم ترى كيف فعل ربك بأصحاب الفيل ألم يجعل كيدهم في تضليل. So that surah, when you complete it, you have to recite also Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, لإله في قريش إلافهم رحلة الشتاء والصيف. Both of them you should write, as I said, because it may not be that they were two, they were one, as there is a claim. So since you have to recite one complete surah, so you have to recite both of them. So that is just to be known. Now we come to Issue 988. See if the time left for prayer is little, or if a person has to helplessly abandon the surah because of fear that a thief, a beast, or anything else may do harm him, or if he has an important work, he should not recite the other surah. In fact, there are situations when he should avoid it, like when the prayer time at his disposal is limited, or when in fear. Well, it is obligatory, as was said in the previous issue, to recite Surah Al-Hamd and one surah. But is this always obligatory? He said no. That if your prayer time is short, you awake in the morning and you have only 5 minutes for sunrise, till the time you perform wudu, 3 minutes or 3.5 minutes has passed. You have only 1.5 minutes for the prayer, for example. Now if you recite Surah Al-Hamd alone and go to ruku' and sujood, you can complete the prayer within the time. But if you like to recite Surah Al-Hamd and one surah, it will take longer time, so your time is tight. So in that case, you say you recite only Surah Al-Hamd, no other surah. Or if you have your luggage, you have your things there, and you find somebody, a thief, has come. Now if you complete and delay your prayer, maybe he will run away and then you cannot get him back. So here you can finish your prayer quickly without reciting a surah, only Surah Al-Hamd, and then protect your money. Or if some animal coming and you fear your life to be threatened, or you get injury, so in those certain situations it is said that only Surah Al-Hamd is sufficient again. And he said actually, if the time is tight or you are afraid of someone, then it should not be recited. You are not supposed to recite the surah. So here he mentioned these exceptions. Issue 989. If a person intentionally recites surah before Hamd, his prayer is void. Because you have to start with Surah Al-Hamd and then one surah. Now if you start with Qul Huwallahu Ahad and then Surah Al-Hamd intentionally, so your prayer is void. And if he does it by mistake and realizes this while reciting it, he should abandon the surah and recite Hamd first and then the surah. I mean, by mistake he started Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and instead of reciting Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, he said Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr wa ma adrak. Then he realized no, he has not time for Inna anzalnahu, he should recite Surah Al-Hamd. So here he should stop it and recite Surah Al-Hamd and then recite the surah afterward. And if he does it by mistake and realize this while reciting it, he should abandon the surah and recite Hamd first and then the surah. Issue 990. If a person forgets to recite Hamd and surah, or either of them, and realizes after reaching the ruku', his prayer are in order. You see, reciting Hamd and surah, as we said, is not rukun, is not one of the pillars of the prayer. We said pillars of the prayer is the niyat, intention, takbiratul ihram, saying Allahu Akbar at the beginning, qiyam, the standing at time of the reciting Surah Hamd and Qul Huwallahu Ahad, and before ruku', and then one ruku' and two sujood. These are 5 pillars of the prayer that if you delete or add them, your prayer is void. But now recitation, intentionally if you leave them, of course your prayer is void. But if not intentionally, you forgot by mistake and you went to ruku' and then you realize that it was a mistake, you have not recited Hamd and Qul Huwallahu Ahad. So how come you missed them? So your prayer is alright. Of course you need to do Sajdat Isaw later on, that is another, but what he means, your prayer is not void. The solution for any missing thing or extra thing is to recite Sajdat Isaw, which is going to mention later on. Issue 991. If a person realizes before bowing for ruku' that he has not recited Hamd and Surah, he should recite them. And if he realizes that he has not recited the Surah, he should recite the Surah only. But if he realizes that he has not recited Hamd only, he should recite Hamd first and then recite the Surah again. Now, if you pass the time, naturally you will not go back. If you are in ruku', you will not break the ruku', stand and recite Hamd and Qul Huwallahu Ahad. You complete the prayer, and as you said in the previous issue, because you forgot, then the solution, Sujdat Isa. But now if you have not gone to ruku' yet, you said Allahu Akbar Takbiratul Ihram, and then you thought that you have recited Surah Hamd and Qul Huwallahu Ahad, and then you said Allahu Akbar to go to ruku', then you have not gone to ruku' yet. You have not bound to ruku'. You realize that you have not recited Hamd and Qul Huwallahu Ahad. You said because it is the time yet, you have not gone to ruku'. Then recite Hamd and first Qul Huwallahu Ahad. If you recited Qul Huwallahu Ahad Surah or Inna Anzalna alone before Hamd, when you finished it, you realized that it was a mistake. Hamd was not recited. Now you will not recite Hamd alone. You recite Hamd, Surah Al-Hamd, and then complete it with Surah of Qul Huwallahu Ahad or Inna Anzalna. You do not say that I already recited it. No, because the order should be there. So you go back, recite Surah Al-Hamd, and then Qul Huwallahu Ahad, and then go to ruku' because you have not gone yet to ruku'. So this is the difference between this issue and previous issue. You are already in ruku'. Said your prayer is all right. But here you are not in ruku', you are still standing. So if you realize you have not recited, recite it. This is the time for it. Moreover, if he bends but before reaching the ruku' realizes that he has not recited Hamd and Surah or only Hamd, he should stand up and act according to the foregoing rules. What he means bend before ruku'? We said when ruku' will start when your fingers reach the knee joint. So now if you bend little, that your finger are not near your knee joint. You bend little before the ruku' start, and then you realize you straight your back and then recite Hamd and Qul Huwallahu Ahad. Both of them, or if only Surah means Qul Huwallahu Ahad or An-Anza was missing, only that, then go to ruku'. So in short, if you are in ruku', because ruku' you cannot make it two, so you cannot go back. Otherwise your prayer will be void. Ruku' is rukun, and rukun cannot be made two. So if you are in ruku', your prayer is all right, and you missed something, you have Sujdat Sahu for it. But if you are not yet reached the state of ruku', even if you bend a little, but not up to the state of ruku', you said straight your back and recite Hamd and Qul Huwallahu Ahad. Issue 992. If a person intentionally recites one of the four surahs which contain verses of wajib sajda in prayer, he will perform an immediate sajda upon reciting the verse. And if he does so as a precaution, his prayer will be void, and he will have to pray again. But if he does not go to sajda immediately and continues to pray, it will be in order, though he will have committed a sin for not going to sajda immediately. You know, there are four surahs where there is obligatory sajda. If you recite it, then you have to go for prostration or sujood. If you recite Surah Al-Hamd and Surah Al-Najm, for example, where there is a sajda, or Surah Fussalat where there is a sajda, you recite it and you reach to the ayah where obligatory sujood is there. What should you do? Well, it is obligatory to do sujood. then if you do sujood, it is okay, that is your duty, but then intentionally you are making one more sujood in the prayer, intentionally, not by mistake, and then you are not allowed, so your prayer is void. So either you should not have recited it first, or if you recite it and you read sujood, you go for sujood and your prayer is void, you should start prayer again. Now if you did not go for sujood, you completed your prayer is alright, but you did haram by not performing sujood, because that sujood is wajib, you did not do it on time, and your prayer will not be nullified, your prayer is alright, but then you did a sin by not performing a wajib sujood. So that is why from beginning you should be aware not to recite any surah which has wajib sujood, those 4 surahs which have wajib sujood. Issue 993, if a person begins reciting by mistake a surah which has verses of wajib sajda and he realizes this before reaching the verse of sajda, he should abandon that surah and recite some other surah. But if he realizes this after reciting the verse of sajda, he should act as guided in the above rule. So you see, if he started with surah with obligatory sajda, before he reached the verse of the Holy Quran where wajib sajda is, he realized that now sujood is coming, so he should stop and change it and recite another surah. And he said he should abandon, is wajib upon him. If he realized before reciting surah sajda, he should not recite surah sajda, that ayah of sajda, because that will nullify his prayer, and you are not allowed to do any act to nullify your prayer. So you should not recite that ayah and turn into another surah, not Surah An-Najm, then you recite Surah Inna Anzalna, for example. And whatever ayahs he recited is alright, it is Holy Quran, no problem. But if he recited the ayah of sajda and then realized, oh, what he did now, he has to go for sujood, so he has to act accordingly, either to go to sujood and his prayer is null and void and he has to pray again, or if he did not do it, his prayer is alright, but he did haram. But naturally he should not commit haram, he should go for sujood and then start his prayer again. Issue 994, you say, if during a prayer a man listens to the verses making sajda obligatory, his prayers are in order, and on the basis of a precaution, he should make a sign of sajda and should also offer sajda after the prayers. Now sometimes somebody is reciting the Holy Quran beside you. You are offering a prayer and he recites the Holy Quran loudly. And that person was reciting one of these 4 surahs where is obligatory sajda. Now you heard him recite that ayah where there is obligatory sajda. Not you are reciting it, somebody else is reciting. Of course, in ordinary case, if you hear him, you have to go for sajda, that is obligatory. But now you are at time of the prayer. Then he said, in that case, you may point out to sujood just by head, and just you show that you are doing sujood, and perform the sajda when your prayer is finished. You do not go to sujood physically, it's not necessary, because if you go, then your prayer will be void, and it is not necessary in this case because you are not the one who recites, somebody else is reciting. So that is the issue. I mean, sometimes in the mosque or in the centers, people are unaware, so they recite ayah of sajda loudly, and then the people, all of them should go to sajda. So they should realize when he reach ayah of sajda, then he recited quietly, he himself alone will go to sajda, and for others it is not obligatory to do sajda because they did not hear him saying it. Yes. Issue 995. It is not necessary to recite a surah after hamd in mustahab prayers, even if that prayers may have become obligatory due to nadr, for example. But as for some mustahab prayers like wahshat prayer, in which a particular surah is recommended, if a person wishes to act according to the rules, he should recite the prescribed surah. See, there are many differences between obligatory prayer and recommended prayer. One of them is this, that reciting a surah after Surah Al-Hamd is obligatory in obligatory prayers, but is not necessary, not obligatory in recommended prayers. So if you like to recite nafilah of Dhuhr, for example, or nafilah of Maghrib or Isha, you can recite only Surah Al-Hamd without Qul Huwallahu Ahad or without An-Nazil, without any surah, and we'll make it shorter for you. If you recite, there is tawab, of course, but it is not obligatory. Your nafilah prayer is all right. So that is, nafilah prayer is all right. But there are in certain prayers special surahs to be recited. For example, Salatul Wahsha. Salatul Wahsha is to relieve loneliness from the deceased on the first night of his burial. Somebody died and he's buried tonight. The mu'mineen are asked to pray this prayer so that he will not feel lonely in the grave. That is the first night he's in the grave. So that prayer will make like a light for his grave, so he will not feel alone there, So that said, the prayer is to recite, for example, Surah Al-Hamd and Inna Anzalna in first rak'at, and then Surah Al-Hamd and 10 times at the beginning Surah Al-Hamd and Ayatul Kursi, in the second surah, Surah Al-Hamd, and 10 times Inna Anzalnahu fi Laylatul Qadr. There are some other ways also said, but for example, that is one of the ways. So now he said 10 times Inna Anzalnahu fi Laylatul Qadr, the Surah Al-Qadr, to be recited. Here, though it is recommended a prayer, it is not obligatory for you to pray, but because it is mentioned specifically that it should be with 10 times of Surah Inna Anzalna, then you have to recite it in order to fulfill that prayer. Otherwise, it looks that you have not prayed that prayer. Issue 996. While offering Friday prayers or Dhuhr prayers on Friday, it is mustahab that after reciting Surah Al-Hamd, Surah Al-Jumu'ah should be recited in the first rak'at and Surah Al-Munafiqun in the second rak'at. And once a person begins reciting one of these surahs, he is not allowed, as per obligatory precaution, to abandon it and recite another surah in its place. That is just a mustahab. In the day of Jum'ah, if you are reciting Jum'ah prayer or Jama'at prayer, Dhuhr prayer, is recommended to start with the first rak'at with Surah Al-Jum'ah, second rak'at after Hamd, Surah Al-Munafiqun. So if you start with it, you cannot change to another one. If you start, you have to complete it and not change. Otherwise, from beginning, if you do not want, okay, you don't start with Surah Al-Jum'ah, you start Surah Inna A'tainaka Al-Kawthar, for example, Surah Al-Kawthar, that's okay. But if you start, then you have to complete that surah. Issue 997. If after Hamd somebody begins reciting the surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad and Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun, he cannot abandon it and recite some other surah. However, if in the Friday prayers and in Dhuhr prayers on Friday, he recites one of these surahs forgetfully instead of Surah Al-Jumu'ah and Surah Al-Munafiqun, he can abandon it and recite Surah Al-Jumu'ah and Surah Al-Munafiqun if it is second rakat. But the precaution is that he should not abandon that surah after having read more than half of it. See, there is a specification for Surah of Qul Huwallahu Ahad, very important, and Surah Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun, بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل يا أيها الكافرون لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عبدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عبد ما عبدتم, till the end of the surah. That surah, if you start with it, you cannot shift to another surah. So you have to complete it. And if it is in Jummah prayer, if by mistake you started reciting قل يا أيها الكافرون and then you realize it is Jum'ah today, okay, you can shift to Surah Al-Jum'ah in first rak'at or to Surah Al-Munafiqeen if it is for second rak'at. But if you completed half of the surah, you recited half of Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad, then at that case you cannot shift to Surah Al-Jum'ah even if it is a Friday time. I mean Friday prayer or Dhuhr prayer in Friday. Because this surah is very important. Both these two surahs are very important. Issue 998, if a person recites intentionally Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad or Surah Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun in Friday prayers or in Dhuhr prayers in Friday, he cannot, as an obligatory precaution, abandon it to recite Surah Al-Jum'ah and Surah Al-Munafiqun, even if he may not have reached half of it. If you intentionally start Surah At-Tawheed, Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad, then you cannot shift if it is a Friday to Surah Al-Jum'ah, because here intentionally you started, then you cannot change it. In the previous issue it was by forgetfulness, it was not intentionally, but here intentionally you decided to read, then you have to complete this surah. Issue 999, if in a prayer a person recites a surah other than Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad or Surah Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun, he can abandon that surah before reaching half of it and recite some other surah. But as a precaution, he should not abandon it after having reached half. And it is not permissible to resort to another surah. Now, he said if not starting with Qul Huwallahu Ahad, he started with إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ فِي لَيْلَةِ الْقَدْرِ. Then he said, no, let me shift to قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ. If he did not reach half of the surah of إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ, then it is okay to shift to Surah قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ or قُلْ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. But if he reached half, he said as a precaution, he should not shift completely. It's better to complete the whatever surah. So in short, if you start with Qul Huwallahu Ahad or Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun, just if you start with it intentionally, then you have to complete the surah, you cannot shift. If you start with another surah, but at the beginning, before you reach middle of the surah, you want to shift to surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad or Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun, is allowed. But if you reached middle of any surah, you have to complete it, you cannot shift to another surah. Issue 1000, if the person in prayer forgets a part of a surah or cannot complete it owing to helplessness, like very little time of a prayer is left, or for some other reason, he can abandon that surah and recite some other surah, even if he may have reached half of it. This applies to Surah Qul Huwallah or Surah Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun also. See, in this case, if you forget, you started Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun, La a'budu ma ta'budun, wa la antum a'buduna ma a'bud, wa la ana a'budu ma a'badtum. Now you crossed half of it, and then you forget how to complete the surah. In this case, if you do not recite full surah, your prayer is void. And this surah you don't know, you don't remember. So in that case, it is allowed to shift to another surah. Then you recite Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr, because you remember Surah Inna anzalnahu, for example. So if you forgot the surah, even if you reached half or after half, you are allowed to shift to another surah. Or for a reason, if the time is tight, which is, I mean, قل هو الله أحد, not applicable. But as I said, if you started with Surah Al-Baqarah and you reached half and then you realize the time is going to finish, then even after reciting half of it, then you should stop it and recite a smaller surah to catch time of the prayer. Issue 1001. It is wajib for a man to recite Surah Al-Hamd and the other surah loudly while offering Fajr, Maghrib and Isha prayers. And it is wajib for a man and a woman to recite Surah Al-Hamd and other surahs silently while offering Dhuhr and Asr prayers. Now in recitation, in morning prayer, Maghrib prayer, Isha prayer, in the first and second rak'at where we recite Surah Al-Hamd and one surah, Inna Anzalnahu, Qul Huwallahu Ahad, they should be recited loudly. For women is not a must, it is only for men. But for Dhuhr and Asr, for men and women, both of them, they should recite it quietly. So in first and second rak'at we should recite Hamd and surah quietly, not loudly. That is obligatory for men and women. Issue 1002. As a precaution, men must take care to recite loudly every word of Surah Al-Hamd and the other surah, including their last letters in the prayers of Fajr, Maghrib and Isha. Here, sometimes people recite a little loudly, but some of the letters or words become quiet because he is breathless or in hurry. So he says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Malik yawm ad-din, iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in, ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. So one word or one letter or one is quiet, the rest is loud. He said, no, even one single letter of Hamd and Surah should not be recited quiet in morning prayer and Maghrib and Isha. All of it should be loud. So all Surah Al-Hamd and all Surah, whatever Surah you recite, should be loud, you know. So if sometimes one is lazy or tired or sleepy or that, then it should be recited loud. He is not allowed. He said, okay, most of it was loud. Okay, now one letter make no difference. He said, no. Even one letter, if you do it intentionally, will nullify your prayer. Well, if by mistake, there is different rule, but intentionally should not be recited quietly because wajib to be loud. Issue 1003. A woman can recite Surah Al-Hamd and other surah in Fajr, Maghrib and Isha prayers loudly or silently. Now we said for men, for Fajr prayer and Maghrib and Isha should be loudly, but for women they can recite either loudly or quietly. It is optional for them. But if a non-mahram hears her voice, she should, on the basis of precaution, recite them silently, especially if allowing him to listen is haram. Now, if somebody, a foreign man is there, now mahram is a foreign man is there, I mean not her husband or son or brother, somebody foreign to her. If he is there and he hears her voice, then she should recite it on basis of precaution. She should recite it quietly. And if she recites loudly with a beautiful voice, and there is somebody, a foreign man there, and he might be influenced by her voice, so here it is a must that she should not recite loudly. So that is an additional stress that according to precaution it should be quietly. Issue 1004. If a person intentionally prays loudly where he should pray silently and vice versa, his prayer is void. But if he does so owing to forgetfulness or not knowing the rule, his prayer is in order. And if he realizes that he is doing a mistake while reciting the surah of Hamd and other surah, it is not necessary to recite again what he has recited, not following the rule. You see, intentionally, if you recite in Dhuhr prayer, your Hamd and Surah loudly, it will make the prayer void. Or if in morning prayer and Isha prayer, Maghrib prayer, you recite quietly, intentionally, your prayer is void. But if not intentionally, you forgot, you started in Dhuhr prayer, for example, you are reciting loudly, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Malik Yawmiddin, Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. When you reached here, you realize that no, it is Dhuhr and has to be quiet. So you have to start Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, quietly, Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim. Then you turn to quiet. Now, is it obligatory to go back and recite Surah Al-Hamd all quietly? He said no. What was already recited loud by mistake, that is okay, accepted. But the time you realize it should be quiet, onward, it should be quiet. So no need to go back. You might have finished Surah Al-Hamd all, and you started with Surah Inna Anzalna, for example. Maybe at the last ayah of Inna Anzalna, you realize to be quiet. Is it necessary to go back to recite them all quietly? You say no. Whenever you remember, then you make it quiet, or vice versa. If it is morning prayer and you recited it quietly, whenever you realize, then recite it loudly. Issue 1005. If a person raises his voice unusually high while reciting Surah Al-Hamd and Surah, as if he were shouting, his prayer will be void. So what they say, the recitation should be loud but not shouting. There is a difference between loud speaking and shouting. So if somebody raises his voice too high, that whoever listens to him, you say, why this man is shouting? So that recitation is not accepted. So it should be loud, and some people may ask, how much loud? What is the minimum loud? What is the difference between quiet and loud? Loud when you speak it and is here, not whispering. Quiet when it is whispering. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. This is whispering. But I can make it quiet, loud, but low. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. That is okay. Or little more. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Still that is okay. So that, but if somebody shout very high voice and loud, they say no, he is not loud, reciting loud. He is shouting. The order is to be loud, not to be shouting. So that is not accepted. Well, sufficient for today, and inshallah we complete other issues regarding Qira'at. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa alihi al-Tahirin. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.